Hey, what's up, everyone? Where's Alan?
I'm over here.
Oh, hey, man. How you
So
doing?
I'll be better probably in about 2 days when I finally get the all clear.
All right. Cool.
Yeah, still under the COVID quarantine.
Well, until you get the all clear, we're just going to have the all clear to start this show. You ready?
I am ready to go, ready to do this, ready to get out of this house. Ah,
Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm Dustin Bass.
and I'm Alan Joaquin.
We are the Sons of History. Look, we've got a great show for you this week. A great guest. We've got Margalit Fox on the show. Alan, this is going to be an incredible conversation. How excited are you for this one?
I'm so excited that I went and started reading because I've got nothing better to do here at home. I've been reading my 4 volume British History Museum books on the Mesopotamian campaign, which, you know, wasn't, well, these are just the histories. They're not as exciting, I don't think, as the book we are about to talk about.
No, absolutely not. And speaking of, she's just put out the book, or it's actually coming out this Tuesday, The Confidence Men. Did you get through any of those before? I mean, how much did you read? How fast of a reader are you?
I'm not that fast of a reader, but this has got some really not so interesting facts. So if you ever have problems with insomnia, this is the book for you, the 4 volume edition.
Yeah, I would say.
The guy that wrote these did not really, I don't think he went to journalism school or anything of the sort. I think he just was like, okay, we need you to write a 4 volume book. And he did it grudgingly too.
Yo Friday, just the facts, man.
Yeah.
That's who wrote it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got Margalit Fox on the show. You're going to love this. She is the author of 4 books: Talking Hands, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, Conan Doyle for the Defense, and the new one that comes out this Tuesday, June 1st, The Confidence Men. We're going to be talking about her new book. And just to give you a little bit of a rundown about her, she is an incredible writer, a longtime journalist. She was actually considered, in 2016, the Poynter Institute named her one of the 6 best writers in the New York Times history. That is a freaking long time. That is a whole lot of writers there. That is mind blowing. She also she was a front page award winner for Newswomen's Club of New York in 2011 for feature writing, and in 2015 again for beat reporting. So without further ado, we're going to bring Margalit Fox on the show to talk about her new book. You ready to go, man?
I'm ready to go.
Let's do it. All right, everyone, we've got Margalit Fox on the show. Margalit, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. It's nice and cool here in New York, unlike where you are.
Yeah, it is a roasty 90 degrees here in Houston. So, yeah, which is why we live indoors. AC, thank God.
I'm having to stay indoors, so I can't go outside and infect people. So
He hasn't seen the sun in quite some time. God bless him. That's but you're still taking the vitamin D, right? Yeah.
taking vitamin D3, C, zinc, elderberry, everything you can
You
throw
know,
together.
I will say this, and it really bothered me last week during the show when you brought up the vitamin C, D, elderberry, and I totally whiffed. And I was thinking about it. I'm like, elderberry, elderberry. And then I was like, I should have said your mother smells of
Yeah,
elderberry.
the
Yeah.
Monty Python.
I'm showing my age. To me, it's, elderberry wine is what the old ladies make in arsenic and old lace, I think.
Oh yeah, was that Cary Grant, right?
Right, that's how they poison people. Put them in the basement.
Beautiful. Well, nobody dies tonight. No one dies tonight, and unfortunately, no wine. But anyways, all right, Margalit. So It is such an honor and privilege to have you on the show. Let me just say that first and foremost. Just the work that you've done over the past, couple of decades is astronomical. And now you are writing books. But before we get into the books that you've written and your most recent one, actually, that comes out, this coming Tuesday, correct?
Tuesday, June 1st.
Amazing.
Right around the corner.
So that is so exciting because this is going to be tomorrow when this will come out, and so perfect timing. But before we get to the books, I want to sort of touch on a bit of your background. You worked for the New York Times for 24 years, correct?
That's right, from 1994 to 2018.
So you were writing. So you did a lot of writing, but you primarily wrote for the obit section. Give us a bit of that, because it's not just, okay, this guy died and that's it. What exactly did you do over there at the New York Times?
Well, my first 10 years at the paper, I was actually an editor on the Times Sunday Book Review. And then in 2004, because I had trained as a journalistic writer and really wanted to write, I was lucky enough to get to move over to obits. Historically, in any newsroom, obits is the job people think they don't want. But the dirty little secret is it's the best gig in journalism because you're paid to tell people's stories. And you're right, it's not just Joe died, the end. If you think about what an obit does, the obit writer is charged with taking Joe from the cradle to the grave. And that gives you a built-in narrative arc. So obits are the most purely narrative genre on any daily paper. And I had the great pleasure for 14 years of getting to do that day in and day out. And I wound up having written between 14 and 1,500 obits.
That's incredible. Okay, one obit that I just know that we have to talk about. You technically did write the obit for the most interesting man in the world, correct?
I assume you're talking about John Fairfax.
Yes.
Yeah, this was a while ago, and I knew it was a cool story. I didn't realize it would engender the response on social media that it did. This was, I would have to look up the date, but this was probably 10 years ago or more, just when things like Twitter were starting to really get big. This was a man who rowed across the Atlantic, that's 4,000 miles in a rowboat, not to be outdone, then rowed across the Pacific, which is twice as wide. He'd done by then all sorts of wild things as a youth, starting with on a scout trip as a boy, stealing the scoutmaster's pistol. This was in Italy. I don't think scoutmasters carry pistols on camping trips here. Stealing the scoutmaster's pistol and waving it at another boy to try to settle a dispute. Fortunately, he was disarmed. When he was 20, he lit out for the Amazon, and there, despondent over a failed love affair, he attempted suicide by jaguar. Fortunately, just as the suicide by jaguar was about to take place, he saw reason, and the gun he had with him did the rest. So indeed, this obit, which I knew was fun, but didn't think would be anything huge. By the next day, I was on to the next one, as one does, but it just lit up the Twitter sphere.
That is hilarious. Yeah, suicide by jaguar.
Not for me. Not for me. I wouldn't want to go that way.
What made me so happy in terms of the reach of that obit was, for a while anyway, there was a band, I guess a garage band or something in the Midwest that called itself Suicide by Jaguar after that obit.
There you go. Inspiration.
It's a great band name.
That is. That's hilarious. So you are retired from the New York Times, a 24-year career. I got to ask you this. You're writing books, but you were writing books before you were officially retired. But you just finished this book, The Confidence Men. You're working on your next one. Does it feel like retirement?
No, but it's what I had been working for all along. I mean, it was an immense privilege to have a long career. at the New York Times, and I love the work. I miss my colleagues terribly. I do not miss the pressure of daily deadlines. I absolutely believe that all writers come into the world hardwired as either long form writers or short form writers. And I am a long form writer in my bones. And I knew from the very beginning of my career that I wanted to write books. That's a very hard thing to do in a way that you can make pay when you're a young journalist starting out. So when, of course, the Times pulled my resume out of a pile in 1994 and asked me to come in as a summer replacement, I grabbed it. And then, like the man who came to dinner, I didn't leave for 24 years. And it turns out that that preparation of daily journalism is the best possible preparation to write a book. Because if you think of the structure, that inverted pyramid structure of a 1,000-word news story, all a book is that same structure gridded up 100 times or so. So it was great preparation. While I was at the Times, I did indeed write my first 3 books, Talking Hands, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, Conan Doyle for the Defense, basically using weekends and vacations. So I was very, very tired and I had no social life, but I got myself to the point as a book writer where in 2018 I could retire early and go out and make a go of just writing books. So that's what I do now.
Awesome. Hey, so
you were there when the one of the greatest historical events in U.S. history, 9/11. That were you? Did you write anything about that, or?
No, I was still at the Sunday Book Review at that time. I was on the book review from 1994 to 2004. So I was not doing much writing for the paper. I was contributing advance obits to the section to try to, cut my teeth in the obit world. And that, when a job eventually opened up there, the reason I got it was because I had a track record doing obits. 90% of our work as obit writers is daily obits written under deadline pressure, the same as any breaking news story. So, if you're lucky, you have a whole afternoon to do it. If you're less lucky, you might have an hour, and it's going to be for the next day's paper. And of course, the website even sooner than that. But the other 10 or so percent are advance obits for people whose careers are so long, so rich, so complex that you don't want to get caught short having to write them on deadline. Of course, sometimes you do because you never know what's going to happen. But when so you write the whole thing, obviously all but the when and the where of it, because the when and where haven't happened yet. And then ideally on the day, all someone has to do, either you or a newsroom colleague, has to put a top on it, as we say. And that's how these long, sometimes 10,000 word obits get into the next day's paper or immediately onto the website as if by magic. It's a really great system. When I left the paper in 2018, I left between 70 and 80 advance obits in the can. So I am continuing to have bylines. When I have them is, of course, in the lap of the gods, but I have anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen a year. So I have the feeling that I left enough milk out for the elves, and they have very obligingly put, a 1,500 word completely reported and written story in the paper under my name, and I have to do nothing. I wish I'd thought of that system years ago.
Did you at any point have to do an obit for someone that you're like, this person deserves to be dead? I'm glad this guy's or this gal's gone. I mean, but you were forced to write something nice?
No, but forgive me, but you're a historian, and there's a fallacious premise at work there.
What's that?
These news obits are not eulogies. They are they're profiles. The only difference between them and a profile of a living person is the news peg for this particular profile is the death of one subject, but they have to be balanced. They have to be straight down the line, warts and all. And so these are not, the flowery tributes that you sometimes see in small town papers, which are because of a lack of staffing, those are supplied by the families or the funeral homes. And it seems that everyone who died in that town was a saint, and he died surrounded by his adoring family or doing what he loved. Read our obits. They're news stories. And so we write, of course, about the great newsworthy heroes of history, but we also write about the newsworthy villains. So I did the obit of Sheriff Jim Clark, the great brutal enforcer of segregation in Jim Crow, Alabama. I did the obit of Charles Manson. And again, these are people who can make your skin crawl. And at the end of the day, you want to go home and take a shower and wash them off of you. But they have to be done soberly. They have to be done right. So you do them.
Fantastic. Well, now that we brought out the dead, let's move on to the living. So you've written 4 books: Talking Hands, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, Conan Doyle for the Defense, and the most recent, The Confidence Men. So of those 4 books, you've got one that has been optioned for a motion picture already, the Conan Doyle, correct?
That's right. Conan Doyle for the Defense was optioned for a motion picture just before COVID hit. And then COVID, of course, had a really devastating effect on the film industry. The whole industry, productions worldwide, pretty much shut down for a lot of the past year. I'm happy to say that it's been optioned by a pretty major Hollywood producer. The screenplay has been completed by a terrific young British screenwriter. I've read it down a number of times, made suggestions. I'm the executive producer on the film, so I have the great privilege of seeing what gets written. I do know that a director is now attached to the project, a fairly well-known director. So with any luck, we may see it on the screen in the next however long. These things take time.
Well, fantastic. I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan, so for some people, it's like, okay, enough already. But yes, I'm a massive fan. I've read all of the short stories, even have a short story of my own that got published. Praise the Lord. But yeah, just watched all of the episodes. Big fan. Can't wait to read this book, and definitely also can't wait to watch the movie. And I don't really see how the new book, The Confidence Men, doesn't get optioned for a movie too.
Well, thank you. From your mouth to God's ears, and what I am at liberty to say is the option is being shopped around even as we speak. So, and the book, which is here, is coming out on Tuesday, June 1st. So I feel like the kid for whom Christmas will just never come and never come, except finally it's almost here.
There you go. So, all right, let's get to it with The Confidence Men. Tell us about this book. What is it about?
Well, I normally revile the phrase elevator pitch because it's so glib and kind of, Gen Y, Gen Z. But for our purposes, it serves as a very nice segue into the book. Confidence Men, it should be pointed out right at the get-go, is narrative nonfiction. Everything is historical. Everything is true. The elevator pitch goes like this. In the depths of World War I, 2 handsome young British officers escaped from a remote Turkish prison camp by means of a Ouija board. Now, if I pitched that to an editor or a producer, they would think I was off my rocker. Yet that is exactly, in 1918, what happened.
That's incredible. So how did you come across this story?
In the most pleasurable way that one can, which is to say, leafing through a dusty, old, long out of print book, looking for something else entirely. In, early 2018, when Conan Doyle for the Defense was in production, I started casting around for a subject for my next book. And I had the vague idea of writing a nonfiction book about pathological imposters, people like the Catch Me If You Can guy, or like Ferdinand de Mara, the subject of the book, The Great Imposter, and the movie of that name starring Tony Curtis. So I pulled from my own library the most wonderful anthology called Grand Deception. I brought it for show and tell by Alexander Klein. came out in the 1950s, and it's this great compilation of essays by various authors about hoaxes and frauds, con men, all of that delicious stuff. And I knew there was an essay on Ferdinand de Mora, the great imposter, in this book. But when I opened the book, my eye fell on an essay with the most alluring title I have ever seen on a work of nonfiction. The essay was called The Invisible Accomplice. So what's up with that? How can you not stop and read something called The Invisible Accomplice? I immediately read it, and it practically made my hair stand on end, which is, takes some doing. But it was an essay by Elias Henry Jones, the chief protagonist of my book, The Chief Escaper, published in the 1930s and reprising this extraordinary World War I adventure in brief. He was one of the two captives at the center of the story. His essay led me back in time to his book-length memoir called The Road to Endor, which he published just after the war in 1919. And in it, he recounts how he and a fellow captive, the Australian-born flyer, Cedric Hill, determined to escape from the prison camp called Yozgad, which was way isolated, high in the mountains in Anatolia, 4,000 feet above sea level, jagged mountains all around the camp, Anatolian desert beyond. And if a POW did manage to get out through that forbidding terrain, he would then have had to contend with thousands of cutthroat brigands, many of them deserters from the Ottoman army, who roamed the countryside and would literally, steal your money and your life. So as a result of all of these forbidding things, Yozgad POW camp was considered escape-proof. As I say in the book, it was the Alcatraz of its time. Nevertheless, Harry Jones and Cedric Hill determined to escape. Their escape plot took the form of a con game, meticulously worked out, rigorously engineered, carefully rehearsed, all in secret, of course, because they were monitored, they were under guard, and kept secret only to them. None of their British Confederates knew about it. There were about 100 British officers interned in this camp. And this con game played out over the course of nearly a year. It's a classic example of what is called a long con. And at the center of this confidence game was a plot to ensnare their Ottoman captors by means of a homemade Ouija board that looks like no Ouija board you've ever seen. It's actually round, and there's a picture of it in the book. It's pretty amazing.
So you've got a couple of dust jackets that are out. The one that is out in Britain, I believe. Mm-hmm. I saw the cover of that. That looks absolutely fantastic.
Right. This is the UK book, and it gives you a sort of a sense of what the Ouija board looks like. The US edition, which is coming out from Random House on Tuesday, I also think is a terrific jacket. They are going more for the kind of spy and thriller iconography. As they say, perfect Father's Day gift. So,
when I was reading a little bit about this book, I kept thinking about the Xenophon book. It comes in a couple of names, Anabasis, and also the March of the 10,000, where you had 10,000 Greek soldiers who had to escape through modern-day Turkey to get to the Black Sea. I don't know if you're familiar with where the Greek soldiers are yelling, "The sea, the sea." Any influence on that in this? Because they go through, it looks like they go through the exact same territory as the 10,000.
To some extent. My two heroes were captured in two different places, although they wound up being dispatched to the same POW camp. Harry Jones, who was a Welsh-born gunner, was one of more than 10,000 British officers who were pinned down for 5 full months in the siege of Kut al-Amara. He was in the Mesopotamian campaign. The Ottoman forces had them pinned down. They were on a peninsula, which means the Ottomans just cut off the top of the peninsula and made a bottleneck. And they shelled them, they shot them, but more than anything, they starved them out. There were 3 unsuccessful relief attempts to bring the British troops and supplies. None of them made it. It was a devastating loss. In the end, something like there were 33,000 casualties on the British side, a great many on the Ottoman side as well. In the spring of 1916, the British finally surrendered, and my hero, Harry Jones, along with 12,000 other British and Indian combatants, became prisoners of war. Jones and quite a number of others were then taken on a 2,000-mile, 2-month forced march through desert and over mountains. Men died along the way, and Jones and his cohort, about 100 officers, wound up at Yozgad, one of the most isolated prison camps in Asia Minor. His confederate, the Australian flyer Cedric Hill, was in the Sinai Palestine campaign. He was a flyer. He was doing a solo reconnaissance mission in a biplane that, to modernize, looks as if it's made of balsa wood. And he was shot down, had a solo 6-hour shootout, holding off Ottoman forces all by himself in the desert before he too was taken a prisoner. He and Jones both wound up at Yozgad. They got there about 2 weeks apart in the summer of 1916. One of the things that all of the captives had to contend with was just this crushing ennui, boredom, these long, empty days, locked in with the same people, the same routine day after day, not able to get out, not able to see new people. Sound familiar? It's a lot of us have gone through a much more benign version of that in 2020. And indeed, in 1918, a Swiss doctor identified this psychological phenomenon of depression, malaise, crushing ennui, nightmares, and he named it barbed wire disease. When my literary agent first read the manuscript, and this was during lockdown, she said, "I think I have barbed wire disease," as did we all. So the men in the prisoners of Yozgad were always casting around for new things to do. I mean, they made a roulette wheel out of an old door. They had to make all their own furniture. There was nothing there. The prison camp comprised 2, eventually 3 empty houses in the town of Yozgad. They were empty because their Armenian owners had been massacred in the genocide of 1915. So those houses became the de facto POW camp. So the men are doing all of these things to try to stave off despair and boredom. One day, in the winter of 1917, they've been at the camp about 6 months, Jones gets a postcard. They got mail irregularly. Sometimes it would take months for letters from Britain to get there if they arrived at all. Jones gets a postcard from an aunt in Britain. Knowing that her nephew had these long, empty hours in captivity, she suggested something that he had never considered. She said, "Why don't you and your comrades try experimenting with a Ouija board?" None of them were spiritualist believers at that time, but it was something to do. And so they made a Ouija board from a sheet of polished iron with a raised wooden ring around it, and they wrote the 26 letters of the alphabet on paper, cut them out in little strips, and then arranged them randomly around this ring. And for a planchette, the thing that you glide, they used, again, everything was salvaged, everything was repurposed. They used an inverted drinking glass, which itself had started out as a jar of potted meat that had come in one of their food parcels. So they have this ersatz Ouija board. Night after night, they try to raise a spirit, and they can't. And Jones realizes that he can keep up his comrades' spirits by faking seances. He has a stellar visual memory, almost photographic. And so very quickly, with his eyes closed, he's already memorized the positions of the various letters around the board. So he starts subtly guiding the glass to spell out responses and introduces all of these wonderful ghosts. And at this point, there's no idea of escape. There's no con game. There's no plot. This is just a lark that he's doing to entertain himself and his fellows. But one of the most moving passages in Jones's memoir, which I quote in my book, and I can almost never get through it without tears coming to my eyes, he says, the spooks that he created were a jovial lot. We could walk with them down Piccadilly, dine in the Trocadero with them, commune with Shackleton on his South Polar expedition. He says we could see anything through the spook's eyes, hear anything through his ears. It was the closest we could get outside our dreams to a breath of freedom. So that was the status quo, just a wonderful lark. Jones's comrades don't know that he is faking these seances. And then in the spring of 1917, he gets the first glimmer of an idea that the Ouija board might actually be his ticket out of the prison camp.
Now, any attempt to escape, whether successful or not, means punishment for those left behind.
That's exactly right. And this was done both in the Ottoman camps, and it should be noted, it was likewise done in Russian prison camps that held Ottoman prisoners. It was a very common way then of discouraging escape, where on orders of the camp commandant, an escape attempt by any one man would bring down severe reprisals against all of the prisoners left behind, lockdown, solitary confinement, and even execution. So the British prisoners at Yozgat were men of honor. They knew they didn't want to endanger their fellows, so they all promised one another they would not try to flee. So for Jones and for Cedric Hill, who became his confederate, the urgent question was, how do we get out of here without compromising our countrymen? And that's where the con game starts to be formulated.
That's incredible. You know, if you think about it, if Jones's aunt, instead of saying the Ouija board, if she would have said a game of Monopoly, they would have probably wouldn't have been able to finish the entire game before the war was over.
Especially because they would have had to wait for Monopoly to be invented. So there is that. It would have kept them in the camp even longer. Like these people in the jungle who don't know the Pacific Theater is over 20 years later. But what's thrilling is that pivotal moment when just this innocent amusement, a lark on Jones's part and kind of fun entertainment on his comrade's part, becomes something more. And what happens in the spring of 1917, when they've been doing the Ouija board for about 2 months, just benignly, is one of the Ottoman captors, the young man who serves as the camp interpreter, approaches Jones, and he's become aware, because there are no secrets in the prisoner of war camp, that Jones has been experimenting with a Ouija board. And he sidles up to Jones and says, "Do you think the spirits can find a buried treasure?" It turns out it had long been rumored in the camp that wealthy Armenians of the region, anticipating the genocide in 1915, at least one of them had converted his wealth to gold and buried it somewhere. Nobody knew where. And the Turkish captors, the camp commandant and some of his underlings, had apparently been searching for this buried treasure in vain. So Joan thinks, somehow, I don't know how yet, but somehow the combination of the Ouija board and this story in the oral tradition of buried treasure, somehow that's going to be my ticket out. And it was. It took most of the next year.
That's absolutely incredible. I mean, it really is. Just to come up with that idea, and not just to come up with the idea, but also to have the honor and the integrity to ensure that what you do may get you killed, but it won't get the, it's to protect your other guys. It's really amazing.
That's right. It really is that classic British man of honor, from central casting. And both Jones and Hill were willing to risk their own lives, but indeed not those of their Confederates. So Jones says, I was determined that somehow my future, my flight out of here, lay with the Ouija board, but I was also determined not only to ensnare my captors, but to give compelling proof of their connivance and leave that proof in the hands of my countrymen when we escaped, and that would protect them. And that's exactly what he did. And it involves, not too many spoilers here, but it involves everything from a secret camera. There were a couple of secret cameras. Camera was an absolutely verboten thing for POWs to have. Cedric Hill, who was brilliant with his hands, made a camera. It was literally a box camera. It was made out of a wooden box that had contained Cadbury's chocolate that had come in someone's food parcel from Britain. And he used that as the body of the first camera he made covertly. And he says after the war, someone took it to London and Cadbury's actually put it on display in the window in London because it was this extraordinary thing. It also involved secret codes that flew between the captives and their families in Britain, because mail in both directions was, of course, vetted by military censors. Jones, who was born and spent his early childhood in Wales, often used Welsh words as signals, and a lot of the codes involve his knowing Welsh. There were magic tricks. Cedric Jones was kind of the brains of the plot, if you will, and Hill was sort of the hands and the heart. I couldn't have asked for a better buddy movie. They came from vastly different social backgrounds. Jones was a highly educated, Oxford-educated son of a British lord. His father, Sir Henry Jones, was a distinguished moral philosopher. He trained as a lawyer, he was working as a magistrate. Hill, who had never been to university, did not consider himself fond of book learning, had been a mechanic on a sheep station in Australia, repairing all the equipment, and was fascinated by aviation, learned to fly. Here's the interesting thing. Military aviation was so new as a concept that when war broke out, he couldn't enlist in his native Australia because Australia did not have a fully functioning military aviation unit. I have a footnote in the book. In, for instance, the New Guinea campaign in World War I, Australia sent a grand total of one airplane, which was never unpacked from its crate on the other end. So Cedric Hill went to England and instead joined the Royal Flying Corps, the precursor of the RAF, learned to fly that way, became a pilot, became an officer. He was also a highly skilled stage magician. As Jones says, he was the best amateur any of us had ever seen. So, of course, he would do magic tricks partly just to entertain his comrades in prison camp, but magic tricks also became a pivotal part of the confidence game, and it was part of how they roped their captors in and got them to believe in the existence of these spirits. And according to the plot, if all went well, the spirits would guide through a series of clues, would guide the captors to the site of this buried gold. If only the captors would lead Jones and Hill out of camp and on the road in search of it. So if all went according to plan, they would be on the road with their captors. The camp commandant, who was this remote, cold, iron-fisted man, would be leading them on the road to freedom, and the Ottoman government would be paying their travel expenses. But if their hoax were discovered, it would be a bullet in the back for each of them. The stakes were as high as can be imagined.
See, that's where I was thinking that this could be a trap, because then they're going to know, all right, if they're faking it, we're going to find out.
That was an ever-present concern that informed every decision they ever made, and was the chief reason that this plan played out over nearly a year, because everything had to be weighed, and you had to, and of course they're working without resources. I mean, any props they need for the con game, they have to make themselves. They're under constant surveillance. So everything had to be mentally run through very, very rigorously and very carefully. And indeed, as happens with the best caper narratives, on the eve of success, they are literally about to get their captors to lead them out of camp. The captors are totally on board with the idea of a treasure hunt that's been guided by a ghost through the Ouija board. Just as that happens, they are betrayed, and the whole plan goes south. They have to very quickly come up with a plan B that will not only cover them in terms of not revealing them as hoaxers, but might actually still lead them to freedom. And plan B is, in a way, as mind-boggling as plan A. Plan B is to feign insanity, each of them faking a different kind of madness, get themselves committed to an insane asylum in Constantinople, now Istanbul, on the slender, slender chance that if they can con highly trained psychiatrists into accepting the fact that they're mad, they might be repatriated to Britain in an official exchange of sick prisoners. So the last third of the book, the center of the book, where they're doing the hoax that has been driven by the spirits, I call that section Ghosts. And then the last third of the book, where they're in the insane asylum, I call Demons.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. It gets intense, more intense.
In the direction I was expecting it to go.
No, nor were they. But as I say, every good con man has to have a plan B. It's as in any caper film, an Ocean's 11 type film, the plotters can plan out everything to the last second. They know when the watchman makes his rounds. They know the combination to the safe. They have the getaway car ready and waiting. Does everything go smoothly? Of course not, because then the movie would be over in 40 minutes. The getaway car gets parked in, or it blows a tire. Something always goes wrong. And indeed, that's exactly what happened with this real life narrative.
No, I'm amazed. I have never heard of this story before.
That's what I loved. That's what I loved about it. What the privilege for me as a journalist with this book and the previous book about a real life wrongful murder conviction that Conan Doyle himself investigates and rectifies. I love finding these stories that have slipped into a crevice in history and not only have the pleasure and the privilege of levering them out again, but also have the benefit of a century of hindsight. And that was crucial for me in approaching The Confidence Men. To get back to the whole elevator pitch, if you say, two guys escaped from a remote POW camp via Ouija board. What I, as a 21st century writer, was desperate to know was how could this crack-brained scheme actually have worked? And first the Ouija board, then the insanity. It did work in the end. They got home. They lived to tell the tale and write the tale. Each of them wrote memoirs. Jones's in 1919, Hill's was published posthumously in 1975, but the memoirs quite reasonably focused sort of on more on process than on explanation. I wanted to know the why of it. Clearly, they had drop by drop administered some kind of psychological cocktail to their captors that turned them, as Jones wrote, into clay in the potter's hands. And the goal I set for myself, with the benefit of 100 years of insight in psychology, 100 years of knowledge of social history, and so on, my goal was to give a precise recipe, all the ingredients of that psychological cocktail. And I'm proud to say that I think I was able to do it.
I was just going to say, it really is, truth is stranger than fiction. Like that is this, that line in a book. And I sort of to play off of what Alan was saying, I think you've done a great service to Jones and Hill. Because, you know, if they're looking down 100 plus years later, he's like, why hasn't anybody written a book about what we did? This is the most incredible thing, and now you've done it, and hopefully it gets turned into a movie as well. So you've done this great service to this incredible story, and it's so wonderful for us to get to hear about it.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to get to share it with people because it is just eye-poppingly strange and wonderful, and yet eye-poppingly true.
You know, I'm going to drive Dustin nuts when I say this because he knows this irritates him more than anything.
Oh, I can't wait.
All right, reading about this, I keep thinking of Indiana Jones. You have Henry Jones. You have a father, Sir Henry Jones, who was a professor himself. And, you know, a little bit of a story that's very similar to what you'd expect from Indiana Jones. I'm seeing visions of this. Okay, go, Dustin.
No, look, you picked the right George Lucas film. If you'd have said Star Wars, I'd have reached through and I'd have punched you in the face.
No, I wouldn't mention Star Wars, not in this capacity.
No, but no, I think that this definitely is. I mean, it is just a scene out of some far-fetched Indiana Jones type-esque, you know, storyline. And what's crazy is that it's true.
It's a real boy's best adventure kind of tale. And indeed, what's crazy is that it's true. When I first gave my agent the proposal to do this book, which she then sold to my regular editor at Random House, my agent, who is a very elegant, erudite, incredibly well-spoken woman, the first words out of her mouth were, "Is this for real? These guys are wild." It was so uncharacteristic of her, but that's the kind of response it engenders. And I was delighted to be able to tell her it's for real. And yeah, these guys are pretty wild.
Now, if they make a movie out of this, who do you want playing Jones and Hill?
Oh, that's an endlessly interesting parlor game. But because the option is being shopped around right now, and my screen agent is in talks with producers right now, whom I sometimes get to talk to as well, I think I'm going to be tantalizingly silent on that point because I'm going to leave things like casting, God willing, to the experts.
So, Margalit, I going over your books seem to revolve around a particular period in culture, end of the 19th century into the 20th century, and it's in the British culture. And I reference Conan Doyle, the book Conan Doyle, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, and then this one. What is it about this particular time and culture that perhaps draws you in?
It's really interesting. Your observation is right on the money, but it wasn't anything I'd planned for. It's a sort of post facto observation that is absolutely correct. What I can tell you, the commonality in all of my books, and this I'm very conscious of, is I am a process freak. So all of my books are nonfiction procedurals in some way. And that's always been my favorite genre in both fiction and nonfiction. The caper procedural, like in Ocean's 11, where you see them assembling the team, you see them gathering their data, you see them getting in their tools and equipment, or on the other side, the police procedural, where you see step by step the detective tracking down the killer. I'm endless to use a fancy Greek term. I'm endlessly fascinated by the heuristics of procedurals, where how does someone get from A to B to C to D, and so on. How much of that knowledge does he have at the outset? How much is gained through these incremental intermediate steps that he has to take? I love that stuff. As for the time period, you're right. It's sort of late Victorian to early 20th century. And I think, as I say in The Confidence Men, it was sort of this liminal age where you had these hurtling achievements in science. You had these extraordinary technologies, radio, electric light, wireless telegraphy, the phonograph, all of these things that seem to make disembodied voices sail through the ether. And in fact, the commonality of those technologies is part of what allowed this confidence game to work. It's part of what, because you had all of these remarkable things that were happening, people communicating over long distances by radio, seemingly through the ether. So it was a legitimate empirical question for many men of science, including, of course, Conan Doyle. If that was the case, could the living also communicate with the dead? Conan Doyle, of course, came to believe that the answer was yes. So it was a fascinating time where you had daily this tension between hard science and spirituality really coexisting side by side, sometimes surprisingly comfortably, to the 20th century mind. So it's an endlessly interesting sort of transitional time.
I've never read any of the Sherlock Holmes books, but one of my favorite Conan Doyle books, or favorite books of all time, is the Lost World. Mm-hmm. So big fan of Conan Doyle. But now anybody famous pop into this book of yours? Cameos? Anyone? People?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. One of the great pleasures about writing historical nonfiction is seeing all of these characters from history, many of them unexpected, who come and visit your narrative. So in The Confidence Men, we have, not so surprisingly, Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, because even before he became involved in the Palestine campaign, he was actually brought in as an ill-fated negotiator to try to end the siege of Kut. The British brought him in to try to bribe the Ottoman government, and he knew the region, he knew the principles well, he knew it was an absolutely lost cause to do that, and of course he was absolutely right. And what ended up happening was the bribe was rejected and the British had to surrender. So that was a disaster. Mark Twain has a wonderful little cameo in the section where I talk about these seemingly magical communications technologies like radio and telegraphy. And my favorite of all, Gertrude Stein. One of the things I wanted to talk about in the book for background was why it is when you use a Ouija board, both the ersatz one that the prisoners made or the ones you can buy in a toy store today, why it is, if you're relaxed enough, that the planchette does seem to move under its own steam. So if you're of a spiritual bent, you think, aha, I'm getting communication from the world beyond. There are actually physiological reasons for this. It's a physiological phenomenon known as motor automaticity that was first identified by an English doctor in 1852. And it has to do with the fact that at something like a seance or a religious rite, you can go into a state of reverie and your hands are moving, but you're no longer conscious of it. one of the psychological investigators who studied motor automaticity in the very last years of the 19th century was a woman named Gertrude Stein. At first I thought, oh, what a funny coincidence. It's like the name of the avant-garde writer. It was the avant-garde writer. As an undergraduate at Radcliffe, she was a student of the distinguished psychologist William James, brother of Henry James, and Gertrude Stein's very first publication of any kind was a scientific monograph in which she studied motor automaticity and actually did experiments of her own doing automatic writing with a planchette. I quote some of the writing that resulted in the book, and what is so wonderful is it's this sort of stream of consciousness that looks exactly like the experimental avant-garde prose that Gertrude Stein, the writer, produced just a few years later in the early 20th century. So who knows, maybe she was channeling spirits all along.
So speaking of World War I, Alan and I, we love discussing that period and that war, but we also mentioned that people often don't know a lot about World War I. I think that your book will help introduce, possibly again, because there's been some really good work done in the arts regarding World War One. Peter Jackson did his documentary "They Shall Not Grow Old," which is fantastic. 1917 that came out, I think, a year or two ago, was a beautiful film. And then your book. Do you think that there is a knowledge deficiency about World War One among average Americans, if not average people in the Western civilization?
Well, that's a huge question, and I can't be responsible for what people in Western civilization know. But what I can say with confidence is certainly when it comes to the POW escape narrative genre, there's a deficiency of awareness. There has been for a long time a whole genre of POW escape memoirs, both in book form and in movies. And I love them. I've been addicted to them since I was a kid. But what are the movies in that genre that people know? The Great Escape, The Wooden Horse, Stalag 17. What do they all have in common? World War II. Clearly, we know, many tens of thousands of people were captured in World War I on both sides of the conflict. Some of them escaped, and some of those even wrote memoirs. Those are much less well known. And one of the things that appealed to me greatly about the chance to revisit this story was that it had been doubly marginalized by history. First, in that it was about World War I rather than II. And second is that it was about the Ottoman theater. When we do occasionally think about World War I, we think about the Western Front, Flanders Field, all quiet on the Western Front. But the Ottoman theater has rightly been called the forgotten theater of World War I. And so there is Jones, under this extraordinary 5-month siege in Mesopotamia, where it's 130 degrees in the shade, and the men are reduced to eating hedgehog fried in axle grease, literally, because there's nothing to eat, starving to death. And there is Hill shot down in Egypt, holding off Ottoman forces with just him and his rifle for 6 hours. So there's this whole fascinating other theater of the war that Westerners tend not to be aware of.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people don't even know who the enemy was during the First World War, and it does get a little frustrating when we're trying to discuss it with some people. But I don't know anything about it. Did we fight the Nazis? And that's about as far as the conversation goes with so many people. So.
Right. I was talking with another interviewer a few days ago about this real disparity in awareness between the escape narratives of World War II versus those of World War I. And he raised the point that in World War II, we have the Nazis, and everyone knows that Nazis are really terrible. So it's this identifiable foe that contemporary people can get their heads around. in World War I, there's no single villain in the same way. And I think that's one of the reasons those stories, stories of escape, have been somewhat lost to time, and also much less susceptible to being made into movies.
Well, I know that there have been a handful of movies from that era. I remember Dr. Zhivago. I remember Lawrence of Arabia.
Mhm.
But if you were to ask me, can you and one of the rare ones would be the African Queen. But beyond that, yeah, there's the 1917 and All Quiet on the Western Front, and I think that's about it. I don't think
Right, and how many of those are about POW escapes to boot? So
that's
there's
correct.
that.
So
Yeah.
and okay, now Wonder Woman just came out that a couple of years ago, and that was World War I. So that was a little bit. I was actually quite surprised by that one. I was like, wow, they're doing a World War I story.
Yeah, exactly. I was a little surprising. I was pleasantly surprised. Yeah.
So and you know what? Then they even showed the Ottomans in that one, so that was even more surprising there. But I am glad that this one is of a time period that needs to be reintroduced because it's not being told enough.
That's right.
So, Margalit, thank you so much for telling this story, and thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you about your new book.
Well, thank you both for having me. It's been great.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, we hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I know that I did. Alan, I know you did, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And I meant it when I said that I had purchased one of her books already, reading up about her. I mean, I don't normally get excited, although I did get excited with a couple of guys we had not too long ago. But this one was like, wow, this lady is a really big deal. So
yeah, so this was huge.
I ordered one of her books. I didn't know all her credentials until was preparing for this show.
And I will give a bit of a shout out. Thank you, Stacy Stein over at Penguin Random House, for reaching out to us to bring Margalit on the show. Book and movie recommendations, sir, to end off this episode?
Well, I think we both know what we're going to pick as our book. It's going to be The Confidence Men. And I mean, it really sounds like something that I cannot wait until I get my hands on. Had a chance to sit and read up about it, and then talking to her and listening to what she has to say. How can you not get this book? Seriously.
Yeah.
So that's
you purchase, and reserve your copy or whatever, but you better get to it because those things are going to fly off the shelf. I mean,
very much.
This thing are really, really glowing, like I was saying earlier. So people are just going to be gobbling this book up.
So now the movie that I'm going to recommend really isn't a movie. It's more of a TV series that came out in the 90s, which is the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Some of the people that make cameos in her book made cameos in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Gertrude Stein and T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. So, I'm a big fan of that time period. Again, this is when Indiana Jones was a kid, so he wasn't yet the big swashbuckler that he was in the 30s that is portrayed in the movies. But definitely, it's a three season DVD set. I don't think it's out in Blu-ray, but it's three season DVD, and I really like the first two seasons. The third one, it wasn't as good, but the first two seasons were really good. Definitely worth getting.
Very good. Awesome. Well, my movie recommendation is Lawrence of Arabia. So this is an incredible movie. As it says, winner of 7 Academy Awards. When Academy Awards were worth winning. Winner of 7 Academy Awards, including the Best Picture. You've got to watch it for a number of reasons, historical reasons, but also if you love movies. Cinematography is absolutely stunning with this movie. The acting is obviously incredible too. But if you just like movies for movies' sake, this is one of those movies. This is probably one of those top 10 movies that you just have to see before you die. So go watch this movie if you haven't yet. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, you have to forgive me. My allergies are shot, so they're out of control right now. But As we always do, we like to end on a scripture. This scripture is from Ecclesiastes 4:9. And since we were talking about the confidence men, it's sort of this buddy book, this buddy story. Why not use this scripture? Ecclesiastes 4:9 says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. These two guys, their return, freedom. And is not a better return than that. So, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings our show to an end. Alan, where can people find us?
Well, they can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, and most importantly, YouTube. Go to YouTube and subscribe to us. We do live streaming now, so subscribe. And now we also have our very own website, www.thesonsofhistory.com. You can find anything you want there, including our merchandise.
Yes, they can. And go purchase some. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. That is it. Go purchase the book, The Confidence Men, really anywhere you can buy books. So check it out. You're going to love her work, as I know that we will. And all right, I am going to go take some allergy medicine, and I will see y'all later.